picture the world Machiavelli was living in when he wrote those words. Exiled, disgraced. The political elite of Florence had tossed him out like a worn-out chess piece. He was stuck in a tiny farmhouse outside the city walls, while the men he once advised drank from silver cups and played at power like children playing with fire. Every night he sat down at a wooden desk with ink that clotted in the cold air. He sharpened quills down to the bone. He read ancient histories. He sank into the world of Roman generals, Greek statesmen, and tyrants whose names echoed through centuries, and out of all that noise he started noticing something embarrassing. The same pattern kept repeating, the same downfall, the same wound, not from war, not from politics, but from women. Not because women were villains or sirens or poisoners in the dark. Machiavelli wasn't a fool. He wasn't scared of women. He was scared of men's delusions. He saw powerful men crumble because they couldn't separate what they wanted from what actually existed. They weren't destroyed by real women. They were destroyed by fantasies wearing human faces. So one night, in a moment of irritation and maybe pity, he scratched down a note that future historians would forget, dismiss, or stuff into footnotes. But if you read it carefully, if you understand the way his mind worked, you realize it's not a note at all. It's a diagnosis. It begins with a single brutal line. Men lose power when they mistake their desires for reality. You can almost hear him sighing through the parchment. This was a man who wrote advice for kings. Someone who'd seen entire governments collapse because rulers believed their feelings were facts. What he noticed was that the battlefield men most easily lose is the one inside their own skull. Machiavelli spent pages describing how men secretly build imaginary versions of the women they date, pursue, admire, or fear. He said, most relationships aren't between two people. They're between a real woman and a hallucination the man desperately protects. It wasn't a moral judgment. It was an observation, the same way he observed that armies fall apart when the general believes his soldiers are braver than they are. The same way princes lose kingdoms because they think loyalty is automatic instead of earned. He saw ordinary men make the same mistake in their personal lives. He wrote about merchants who destroyed their fortunes, chasing women who offered them admiration but never commitment. He wrote about husbands who convinced themselves their wives had supernatural purity, then shattered when they found out she was simply human. He wrote about young men who believed they were entitled to romance simply because they felt desire. Machiavelli called it a mirror of ego, a trap where a man uses a woman to reflect back the version of himself he wants to believe in. The smarter the man, the deeper the trap, because intelligence doesn't kill delusion. It only decorates it with better excuses. He believed that love wasn't the problem. Fantasy was. He said, a man's downfall begins the moment he treats imagination as evidence, centuries before therapy existed, before pop psychology, before anyone said attachment issues or projection. Machiavelli was already mapping the emotional geography of men. The same guy who was accused of being cold-hearted and manipulative was secretly writing about the tender, ridiculous delusions that control men's choices. He studied the way men talk to themselves, not out loud, but in the silent, private, dangerous space of their own expectations. And he noticed something else, something so uncomfortable that most modern audiences pretend he never said it. Women rarely fell for the same illusions. Not because women are perfect, not because women are immune to longing, but because women lived closer to consequences. A man could afford fantasies a woman couldn't. In his era, if a woman made the wrong choice in love, she could lose her reputation, her security, her safety, her entire life could collapse. So women learned to see reality faster, sharper, with instincts that men interpreted as cunning or manipulation, but were actually survival tactics. Machiavelli respected that more than he respected most princes. He believed that if men studied women with the same seriousness they studied warfare, they'd avoid half the disasters that ruined them. But they never did, because facing reality feels like defeat when your whole life runs on your imagination. Part 1 ends with Machiavelli sharpening the dagger he's about to stab into the illusions of men everywhere. He wasn't just writing about women. He was writing about men's refusal to see women clearly. To him, women were not angels or demons. They were human. It was men who invented the monsters. Part 2. How men fool themselves. Machiavelli broke down men's illusions the way a surgeon cuts away layers of infected tissue. Clean, precise, no mercy. He didn't care about feelings. He cared about truth. because truth in his worldview is the only thing that actually protects you. He described 3 illusions like traps built by the man himself, not by the woman, and not by the world, but by the man. The traps are psychological, internal, invisible until they blow up your life. Illusion 1. The muse. Machiavelli hated romantic myths. He believed the idea of a woman as a divine muse who inspires a man was one of the most destructive fantasies ever invented. He wrote that men often project their insecurity onto a woman and call it inspiration. They expect her to motivate them, validate them, stabilize them. He said men don't fall for a woman. They fall for the feeling she gives them about themselves. A woman smiles at him, and suddenly he thinks he's valuable. She laughs at his joke, and suddenly he thinks he's charismatic. She pays attention to him, and he thinks he's found meaning. Machiavelli believed that the desire to be seen drives men into illusions faster than love does. When a woman offers a moment of emotional clarity, the man inflates it into destiny. He gives her supernatural significance when she's simply a person having a conversation. The worst part? He believes his feelings are evidence. Once that illusion takes root, the man becomes blind to her boundaries, her intentions, her humanity. Illusion 2. The savior. This illusion is louder, messier, more self-righteous. Machiavelli said, the man who tries to save a woman is usually trying to avoid saving himself. He described men who believe they can heal a woman's trauma, fix her behavior, or rescue her from her own life. He ridiculed the fantasy that love can purify someone who hasn't chosen to change. He considered it a strange form of arrogance, a disguised hunger for control. He said, men who chase the savior illusion are often terrified of their own emptiness. Helping her is easier than facing themselves. So they create a narrative where she is broken and he is noble, where she needs him, where he becomes the hero in his own emotional novel. He called it charity of ego, a man helping a woman not out of compassion but out of desperation to prove he matters. When reality eventually shows up, the man gets angry, not because she failed him, but because she failed his fantasy role for her. Machiavelli believed this illusion leads to resentment, chaos, and sometimes cruelty, because you cannot rescue someone who never asked to be saved. You can only exhaust yourself. Illusion 3. The ideal. This is the illusion Machiavelli despised the most. The idea that somewhere in the world exists the perfect woman, tailored, flawless, designed to match the man's needs. He said, this illusion is the most widespread because it feeds the male ego perfectly. The ideal woman always loves him, always understands him, always forgives him, always supports him, never challenges him, never exposes his flaws, never demands self-reflection. Machiavelli saw the ideal as a psychological escape hatch for men who fear intimacy. The more scared a man is of being truly seen, the more obsessed he becomes with the hypothetical perfect partner. A woman so perfect she can't possibly exist. He warned that chasing the ideal turns men into addicts, addicted to hope, addicted to imagination, addicted to potential instead of reality. He wrote, the man who searches for perfection is afraid of a witness, the witness being a real woman who sees who he actually is. The luxury of delusion ruins the discipline of perception. Machiavelli said, this mental weakness transfers into everything, work, ambition, decisions. You don't just fool yourself in relationships, you fool yourself everywhere. The illusions blur into life choices, he said. Men who lie to themselves in love will lie to themselves in politics, economics, and self-governance. They become unreliable rulers of their own lives. They lose power not because someone stole it, but because they traded it away for fantasy. Machiavelli believed the man who cannot handle the truth about women cannot handle the truth about anything. Part 3. The reality he saw. Machiavelli didn't romanticize women, but he also didn't underestimate them. He watched the men around him puff up their chests about logic and reason, while the women in their lives quietly saw through every delusion those same men drowned in. He noticed that while men strutted around confident in their fantasies, women operated in reality with frightening accuracy. A prince might misjudge the loyalty of his advisors, but he'd almost never fool the woman who lived under his roof. Not because she was mystical or manipulative, but because she was paying attention. Machiavelli believed that centuries of inequality didn't weaken women, it sharpened them. When you live in a world where your security depends on reading someone's emotions correctly, you develop a level of intuition men mistake for supernatural insight. He wrote about noble women who could sense political danger before trained soldiers did. He described wives who predicted their husbands' betrayals before the men even consciously decided to betray. He wrote of courtesans who could assess the ambition, cowardice, or desperation of a man simply by the way he spoke to a servant. To Machiavelli, this wasn't magic. It was survival intelligence. He said, women learned early that the world wasn't going to adjust itself to their needs, so they mastered the art of adjusting themselves just enough to stay safe. That constant adaptation trained an internal radar that men rarely developed. He compared male perception to a torch, bright in one direction, blinding everywhere else. Female perception, he said, was like a lantern, soft, wide, and uncomfortably honest. He believed this difference explained why men often misunderstood women entirely. Men watched actions, women watched patterns. Men heard words, women heard inconsistency. Men judged intent, women judged behavior. Machiavelli wrote that if a woman felt something was off, she was almost always right. Not because she saw the future, but because she saw the present more clearly than the man did. He saw it in political families, merchant houses, marriages, and scandals. Men fell for flattery. Women noticed the twitch in the flatterer's eyebrow. Men trusted promises. Women trusted history. Men used power to feel secure. Women used understanding to survive. He once wrote that a man with authority often loses judgment, while a woman with none develops it to perfection. When men were armed with influence, money, and status, they didn't bother learning people. They didn't have to. Women lacking those shields became experts. Their intelligence wasn't optional, it was defense. He wasn't praising women for being saints. He was admiring their strategic instinct. He thought it absurd that men interpreted that instinct as manipulation. In his mind, if the world forced you to read the room to stay alive, how could that possibly be manipulative? It was competence. He described the average man as politically naive in his personal life. A man could navigate alliances between nations but fall apart because he didn't understand the intentions of the woman he was sleeping beside. He called it tactical blindness, the tendency for men to study the external world more seriously than the internal one. To Machiavelli, the internal world was the real battlefield, the world of motives, sensitivity, suspicion, trust, and intuition. Women lived in that world whether they wanted to or not. Men visited it rarely and usually tripped over their own pride as soon as they did. He believed the imbalance was so extreme he called women the uncredited political force of every household. Not because they conspired, but because they knew more than the men realized. Men underestimated them because it felt safer to underestimate them. Machiavelli warned that a man who doesn't respect a woman's intelligence isn't superior. He's vulnerable, because the person you ignore is the person you can't predict, and the person you can't predict is the one who can ruin you without lifting a finger. He wrote, "A man fears a woman's influence because he can neither measure it nor eliminate it. Influence shaped by perception is invisible. It works before you detect it," he said. A woman's silence could be more revealing than her words. Her discomfort could be a prophecy. Her withdrawal could be a warning. The tiniest shift in tone could reveal more about the relationship than weeks of male certainty. To Machiavelli, men weren't losing power because women were manipulative. They were losing power because women were observant, and he thought it foolish that men refused to learn from that. By the time he finished writing about this, he made something painfully clear. Men underestimate women because it protects their ego. Women underestimate men because they've learned better. Part 4. The Cost of Ignorance. Machiavelli argued that a man's downfall rarely comes from enemies who openly oppose him. The real damage comes from what he refuses to confront about himself. He believed relationships, more than war or politics, expose those blind spots with surgical cruelty. He listed the ways men sabotage themselves not through malice but through ignorance. He said men chase validation instead of stability. They want admiration more than connection. They confuse attention with devotion. The line between affection and ego boost is so blurry that most men sprint across it without noticing. He wrote that men treat romantic attention like currency. Once they get a little, they start spending it irresponsibly. They assume consistency where there is none. They hear promise where only politeness exists. They seek loyalty from situations that were never defined. Machiavelli believed the most dangerous relationship is the one based on assumptions. Assumptions are cheap. Reality is expensive. He also dissected why men reward behaviors they complain about. He found it laughable that a man would claim he wants respect yet reward the woman who treats him unpredictably. He said it was the same instinct that made rulers hire corrupt advisors. Familiar chaos feels safer than unfamiliar stability. He wrote, "A man prefers the storm he knows to the calm that requires discipline." He said, "Men often pick partners who match their emotional wounds, not their goals. They choose drama because drama feels meaningful. It feels alive. It drowns out the quiet echo of insecurity." To Machiavelli, this wasn't romance. It was self-destruction disguised as passion. He believed clarity was the strongest romantic currency, but men fear clarity because clarity demands responsibility. If you define the relationship, you define the expectations, and expectations reveal whether you're ready or not. He described countless men who chose ambiguity because they didn't want to be accountable for loyalty, effort, or leadership. They wanted freedom without consequence, but ambiguity is the perfect breeding ground for betrayal. If you build something unclear, it will collapse clearly. He wrote that every emotional disaster a man experiences begins long before the heartbreak. The seeds were planted in the moments he avoided difficult truths. Men ignore red flags because truth threatens fantasy. Once truth enters the room, fantasy dies, and fantasy is addictive. He said, "The man who runs from small truths will be destroyed by large ones." He studied how men responded to warnings. He noticed that women often warned men early, subtly, repeatedly. Not always with words, sometimes with impatience, withdrawal, hesitation, or discomfort. These signals were not manipulation. They were communication. Men ignored them because the warning clashed with the illusion. He believed ignorance has a price, and the price always includes humiliation. Men think heartbreak is the disaster. Machiavelli said, "The real disaster is the loss of self-respect that comes from ignoring your own intelligence." He wrote about men who realized too late that the red flags were not clues about her. They were clues about him, his insecurity, denial, pride, and emotional laziness. To him, the real danger wasn't losing a woman, it was losing clarity. He argued that relationships do not ruin men. Men ruin themselves and relationships reveal it. Women become mirrors, not because they choose to be, but because intimacy exposes everything. He ended this section with a harsh truth. A man who cannot face truth in love cannot face truth in life. That was his warning, not a curse on women. A diagnosis of men, Part 5, the core message. Machiavelli's central warning could be summarized in one phrase: master yourself or be mastered. He didn't couch it in niceties. He didn't sprinkle it with flowery metaphors. To him, love is a battlefield, desire is a trap, and the greatest casualties are the men who refuse to see the terrain. He insisted that understanding a woman is impossible without first understanding yourself, because every illusion you carry, every hope, fear, insecurity, and ego-driven assumption distorts reality. The woman isn't the obstacle, your unexamined mind is. He wrote about men obsessed with winning affection, winning, as if love were a game of strategy instead of a reflection of compatibility and honesty. These men spend years building plans, manipulating appearances, and convincing themselves that desire is evidence of compatibility. Machiavelli saw this as the ultimate human folly. He argued that a man's mind is like a city. If the walls are crooked, if the streets are cluttered, if the towers lean on shaky foundations, the city falls apart. You can't expect stability outside when your interior is chaotic. He believed women sense the structural integrity of this city immediately. They perceive whether the foundation is solid or rotten. He outlined the consequences of ignoring this principle. Men attract partners who amplify their weaknesses. Men remain blind to manipulation, not because women are deceptive, but because they themselves refuse scrutiny. Men repeat the same mistakes in relationship after relationship, each time believing the problem is external. Machiavelli insisted that clarity of mind is the only way to navigate desire safely. A man must, first, identify his weaknesses without flinching. Second, accept the uncomfortable truth of his motives. Third, recognize that emotions are signals, not instructions. Fourth, distinguish between projection and perception. Without this self-mastery, he wrote, men are doomed to be deceived by their own fantasies, and the world reacts in turn, not out of malice, but out of inevitability. He even went further, touching on a concept few modern men would consider without irony: discipline in emotion, not suppression, not avoidance, understanding, observing, acting with intent rather than impulse. He described it as mental fortification, a way to approach relationships as both human and strategic, as both emotional and rational. Machiavelli argued that this was not cold-hearted, it was survival. He warned that ignoring this advice leads to repeated disaster, not because women are untrustworthy, but because a man's ego is fragile. He tries to protect it by ignoring reality, creating stories that are kinder than the truth, imagining loyalty where none exists. The ultimate irony, Machiavelli noted, is that men chase women to complete themselves when in reality they need to complete themselves before they can see clearly. Otherwise, the pursuit is not love, it's desperation. He wrote, "A man who does not master himself cannot hope to understand a woman, and a man who does not understand a woman cannot hope to master anything." He treated this principle as a rule that applies universally in love, in politics, in ambition, in survival. Mastering self-perception is the first and only real weapon a man can carry. Without it, all strategy fails, all influence is illusion, all power collapses. This is where his genius turns cruel. He doesn't excuse human weakness, he exposes it. He says the truth in all its discomfort. A man's chaos will be reflected back to him by the women around him, not to punish him, but because reality cannot be ignored forever. He ends the section not with comfort but with challenge. The world will not bend to your fantasies. The woman beside you will not. Only you can decide whether to live in illusion or survive in clarity. Part 6, the final warning. Machiavelli closes his message with the sharpest edge of all. The final warning is simple. Fear is misdirected. Men fear women. They fear rejection, betrayal, emotional pain. They imagine women as unpredictable forces of chaos. Machiavelli turns this on its head. Men should not fear women. Men should fear themselves, the aspects of themselves that women inevitably expose. The ego, the denial, the cowardice, the laziness, the projection. He described women as mirrors, not because they enjoy reflecting men's flaws, but because intimacy reveals what cannot be hidden. A woman does not need to act. Her presence alone can illuminate the cracks in a man's character. He gave countless examples. Princes who lost kingdoms because they misjudged their advisors. Husbands who lost respect because they ignored reality. Sons who squandered legacies because they believed their fantasies. In each case, women played no role other than reflecting truth. They became the inadvertent arbiters of consequence. Machiavelli warned, the reflection may be uncomfortable. It may be humiliating. It may demand change. But it is the only path to strength. He emphasized that men rarely recognize the danger until it is too late. They misinterpret warning signs, misread behavior, and mislabel insight as manipulation, and when disaster finally arrives, they blame external forces, the woman, the enemy, fate itself, never themselves. He was brutal. Self-awareness is not optional. The failure to recognize the truth about oneself leads to repeated cycles of destruction, heartbreak, frustration, failure in ambition, loss of respect. All are symptoms of refusing to see reality clearly. He concluded with one line meant to burn into the mind. Do not fear women. Fear the parts of yourself they reveal. He left it ambiguous whether this was advice, prophecy, or a curse, perhaps all three. But the message is unmistakable. Every man's greatest enemy in love, ambition, and life is himself. Women, in their clarity, simply highlight the battleground, and then in the last few sentences, Machiavelli offers hope disguised as warning. The truth revealed by women can destroy you, or it can empower you. The difference is whether you are willing to confront your own chaos. This is not about domination or manipulation. It is about awareness, discipline, and courage. The courage to face the parts of yourself that are easiest to ignore. The courage to admit mistakes. The courage to abandon illusions. Machiavelli's final note is as cold as it is raw. You can endure every external threat, survive every external battle, and still lose everything if you cannot endure the war within yourself. That war is revealed in women, and only in women.